What's up, dudes? HW here. Just jamming in the afternoon down here in the studio. Was working on some other stuff this morning, so I got a little bit of a slow start here. And it's a beautiful afternoon out here in Nashville. And I thought, you know what I thought would be fun? Today I want to talk about 3 things that I've learned after owning probably in the neighborhood of like 300 guitar amplifiers. Now, at the time I'm shooting this video, I've got a bunch of amps back here. I've got a ton more amps this direction, a bunch on this wall you can't see. Other videos you've seen around the studio here. I think I own right now 50, 55 amps, and I think that makes me an amp collector, And I'll talk about this in a future video. What does it mean, I think, to collect amps? Or collect anything, really. When did I start collecting? I'll get into that in the future. But here's something I've learned, because at the beginning of my journey to sort of like collect amps and everything, I didn't really have a goal. I just wanted to try a bunch of different stuff, I would hear people talk about an amp. I'd hear people talk about it on the Gear page or on Harmony Central. And I'd hear people use all sorts of words and they describe things, And as a young player, people would be like, it's like a deluxe reverb, but more sparkly in the highs. And I go, I don't really know what that means, or it's like the best AC30 you've ever heard, but with more punch and tighter bass, It's like, oh, okay. Are those things not, what an AC30 is already? I didn't know. I didn't, and it's hard to, kind of read and watch opinions happen in front of you without hearing it. That's one of the great things about YouTube. Is I can show you some of the stuff that I'm talking about when I'm trying to describe it. Because words really don't do justice to sound, What's the old saying? A picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, try to describe a song, I think even harder. I think really, I think you could describe a picture a lot better than you could describe a song, which is interesting. But, so I want to talk about 3 things I've learned. So one thing I've learned is this. I've got a 65 Deluxe Reverb here, and it's a beautiful sound. It's a great sound. Old Tokai LS120 with the Marses in there. One of the things that I notice is there's kind of these food groups, and people refer to them a lot. Fender is one, sort of Fender black face, black panel is one. And, what does that mean? There's so many different Fender amps, right? It's like, and they all kind of sound different. But one of the things that I've figured out that I learned that was surprising to me, that I think the internet gets completely wrong, is that Marshall plexis are clean. They're clean amps. They're not dirty at all. And I'll tell you what I experienced. I would buy late 60s plexiglass amplifiers, and when I started doing them for the Kemper, I'd get all these people like, how come you don't do the amp on full? And I'd be like, I did do the amp on full. And they'd be like, it's not very dirty. How come you didn't like go all the way up to 10? And it'd be like, I did go all the way up to 10, and there's a boost on 10 and a boost. And it made me realize, because I think Marshalls were one of the amps that I got my hands on early enough before I had a real like misconception, I should say, about what a plexi sounded like. Late 60s and 60s plexi panel amplifiers are much cleaner than their 70s counterparts. In 69 and a half, so somewhere midway through 1969, Marshall starts using brushed aluminum panels instead of the old plexiglass panels. Now, those amps are commonly called, I think plexi is sort of something that incorporates the sound of old super lead and super bass amps. And I think that I'm the type of person where I say that includes brush panel amplifiers from the 70s. A lot of people go, no, a plexi is just the 60s era. I think when you're talking, when someone is talking about the plexi sound, they often are also in their head thinking of the sound of a 71, 72, 73, going up into the mid 70s Marshall, because those amps are basically identical except for some internal component changes. They don't introduce master volumes until the late 70s. They don't really do anything to the amplifiers in terms of changing the look of them except for that small change. They function and look and sound for the most part like those amplifiers, but the sound actually changes a lot. I say they sound the same. In relation to every other kind of amplifier, it's the same amp, but in relation to itself, it's very different. As different as I think a JTM 45 sounds to a plexi. That's how different I think they are. Components were changing. I don't know if voltage was changing, but for sure, I have two older 60s plexis. I have a PA and a 50 watt head. And then I have a 74 50 watt head, a 71 100 watt head, a plexi, and I have a 74 super bass. All of the plexiglass amps, regardless of regardless of wattage, regardless of the type of amp, are cleaner. They're just cleaner, even on 10. They don't have the high-end bite and the gain that the other ones do. And I would say it's a full 2 or 3 blip difference. Not really, because both amps sound like they're on 6 when they're on 6, but you can hear one is just giving more overdrive, more breakup, and the other is just really increasing in saturation. And it's really something that I notice is just one of the biggest misconceptions out there. People think plexi sound a certain way, and a lot of times when they're thinking of a more gainy plexi, they're often thinking of the 70s amps. And usually the 70s amps, what I find is what they mean is the 70s amps boosted with some sort of, boost in the front, because they just didn't produce a ton of bass, or a ton of gain on their own. Unless you really pushed them. Now, of course, you get and you can hear that in 70s rock music is dirtier than the 60s stuff. You can hear that when you start hearing the fuzzes and everything, and you just hear it. You just do. It's one of the many things that I just sort of picked up while playing a lot of different amps. The older the amp, when it comes to Marshall, the cleaner it is. That's really the truth. Now, by the time you get to the 70s, things start changing. The amps are getting bitier, gainier, more trebly, sizzly. That's how I would describe the aluminum panel sound. And that's what I think a lot of people think plexis sound like. Some of that could be speakers too, which gets into my next point. Speakers make all the difference in the world. And I think really they're responsible for a lot more of the sound that people describe in amplifiers than they realize. When I started getting into these old Fenders, these black panel Fenders, one of the things I noticed early on was how every model you could buy of like a black panel Fender had like 3 speakers that could have been the stock speaker. And that stuck out to me as strange. And so the more research I did, the more I realized, okay, basically what they had in 63 and 64 was the original design. In 65, the company's bought out. CBS gets control of the company, and the first thing they start doing is changing speaker manufacturers, because without getting involved, without having a tech or an engineer get involved in how can I make this amp more cheaply, they took over the company and they want to continue operations, right? But they need to now start transitioning into wherever they're going to go next, right? How do they make this company more profitable? Well, one of the first things, the easiest things to do is, okay, we wire up these amps and we get the speaker from somewhere else. Well, where can we get the speaker from that might be different? So those first Jensens you see that are the original Jensens are really pretty dark. They're in almost every model of the blackface Fenders. If you get one of those original gold stickered Jensens on the back, that's original to the amp, original to the design that Leo made, they are dark and warm, and they are not really what I think of as the later, brighter Fender sound. Now, in the 70s, in the Silverface era, really in 68, we see the first Silverfaces. In 69, we see them. in that, those first ones are drip edge. They have the drip edge around the end. That ends up, they want to save more money the next year, so they take those off. Those are the best looking amplifiers, I think. What's interesting to me is the same amp, when you get to that 68, 69 area, when they start making little changes in the amps, and the previous 65, 66, 64 Fender, the black face Fenders, those amps sound identical to me, or like really practically in the room. They sound pretty much identical, and if you put them through the same speaker, in every case I've tried. Now, do they sound different? Of course, but I've also had two blackface amps sound different. So what I'm saying is, you get that first year where like a deluxe reverb goes to the silver panel in 68, and you get a 66, that's supposed to be the original spec. Those things will sound as close together as two 65, 64, 66 deluxe reverbs. It's just component changes if you put them through the same speaker. But as soon as you start seeing those blue, the blue speakers, which I believe are Eminence made, the blue sticker on the back of the Fenders, those speakers are brighter. And if you run even a black panel amp through those, you see the difference in the speaker. There's also all these anomalies where you occasionally see like Vibroluxes, which are the 210 combo, with the speakers from a Super, because they would run out, and then they would put whatever speaker was in there. You also see like the Vibraverb, which had, and the Pro Reverb initially had 15-inch speakers, right? You see those change from JBL to I think an Altec Lansing later on, or something like that. You see those that makes such a big change in the speaker as well. And if you take like something like a Vibrolux, and you take something like a Super Reverb, you really realize, and you put them through the same speaker, like you run them both through a 15-inch, like Vibraverb cabinet, you realize these amps are very similar. And that was sort of Leo's thing. I think when he was designing those amps, it's funny, Leo made his products, in such a way that it could be made by, older ladies, older Mexican ladies. That was the workforce he had in Southern California at the time. Most of them first-generation people who maybe were not very well educated. I mean, you can imagine in 1960, someone who grew up, who was born who was 50 years old in 1960. That means they were born in Mexico in 1910, and this was a large part of the workforce in Southern California at the time, and they were factory workers. They were born before electricity, had come through Mexico and through a lot of the United States, especially the South and the Southwest, late getting electricity, way behind everybody else. My own grandmother grew up by, doing homework by oil lamp. She grew up in Louisiana. They didn't have electricity at that time in most of Louisiana. And so you think of the people, they probably don't have a high degree of formal education, but they were factory workers. So they knew how to use this machine or that machine, or maybe they'd worked in a sewing factory or some other factory operating some machine. And that's kind of how you did manufacturing. You had machines and you had to train someone to be a machine operator. Well, Leo had designed these things to be built with a soldering iron and a screwdriver at a station where one person could sort of build these things. And very simple. Why would that guy who was focused on that amount of efficiency go on to make like 13 to 16 of these amps? He was just listening to feedback of professional players. He'd make a deluxe, and someone might say, well, this is great, but I wish it had two tens or something. And they'd make the Vibraverb. And then it's like, okay, great, but I kind of wish it was like a piggyback combo. We'll make the Tremolux, right? We'll make the gain even lower, because not everyone wanted, a breakup, the twin, probably because that 100-watt guy, probably because people playing slide wanted real clean, really high headroom. The Bassman, it was made as a bass cabinet to project the bass sound outward, and he made that amp, I believe after he made the bass guitar for it. And so it's really interesting how all these amps seem to have all these different iterations. But anyway, the speakers just produce so many more iterations of the Fender sound. And I would say the Fender sound is one of the ones where I think most people, they think of a clean, bright, scooped sound, and they go, that's the Fender sound. And to me, that's just one of the craziest statements. That's the Fender sound? That's not the sound of a deluxe reverb. Or I'm sorry, that's not the... Yeah, I wouldn't even say that's the sound of a deluxe reverb. Deluxe reverbs are far more mid-rangey than on so many of their other counterparts like supers or twins. A twin and a deluxe sound almost nothing alike. A deluxe is hardly the little brother to a twin reverb. And then you get something like the Tweed Deluxe and the Tweed Bassman. Those are another complete era of amps. They could be made by another company. In fact, those amps are far closer to like an old Magnavox or a Magnatone or one of like the Sears amps, like a department store type thing, like a Silvertone. They're far closer to something like that than the later Fender stuff in terms of sound to me. And the last thing I learned owning so many amps was this. After about 300 amps, I am convinced of one thing. Nobody seems to know what a Vox AC30 sounds like, because I hear every non-Fender style boutique amplifier described as kind of like a Vox AC30, but blah, blah, blah. Vox-ish, kind of Voxy, sort of Vox-esque. Sounds like an AC30. And when I first plugged in an AC30, an early 60s AC30, and the guy I was with, Stu, he started playing Day Tripper on an old Gretsch, I immediately went, I've played 100 amps that said they sound like a Vox, not one of them sounds like that. And that's a funny thing. It's kind of like chicken. You know how people say everything tastes like chicken? It's one of those things where it's like, everything tastes like chicken, but it doesn't really taste like chicken. It just tastes maybe not so strong. I don't really know what people mean by that. Nothing sounds like an AC30, nothing. I mean, of course, there's very close clones to an AC30, but sometimes I hear these people like, oh, this is our recreation of an AC30, blah, blah. And it might have some AC style characteristics, but they don't sound like AC30s. Even Matchlesses and Bad Cats and stuff, that's really an evolution of the AC30 sound. But those 12AX7 channels don't sound like AC30s. The 90s Voxes don't sound like AC30s. You go get an old AC30 and plug that thing in. It is incredibly thin on the Brilliant channel. Top boost or non-top boost. It's incredibly thin on the Brilliant channel. The normal channel is so thick, so full. Oh, and that's the other thing about plexis. Those channels are so far away from each other, it's actually difficult to use the amps. It's a good thing that people changed amp designs later on, because it's actually very difficult to get a usable sound out of the normal and the bright. It almost seems like neither the normal or the bright channel of a plexi and of a Vox was actually designed for a guitar. It just seemed like someone going, how different could we make these two channels? Like, how dark could we make this? How bright could we make this? That's what those old amps feel like. None of it feels like a nice balanced in the middle kind of thing. Which is actually why I think the Deluxe Reverb ended up being, and the Princeton ends up being so popular. Because you can make them full or kind of bright sounding with just the knobs. They start from a fairly neutral place. But you take a Vox on that Brilliant channel, and you turn that thing anything past 7, the bass just falls apart. It gets fumbly and grumbly, and the speakers probably aren't the best choice for it, to be honest. But when it's in the sweet spot, there's something magical about it. And so nothing sounds like a Vox, nothing, no matter what people make. Now, of course, there's these, highly accurate Vox clones. Those sound like Voxes. But those are like clones. I'm talking about all the boutique people who make amps, 65 amps and Gabriel Voxer and all these things. Anybody who does a take at all on the Vox sound, or they go like, oh, here's our sound with a, it's kind of Voxy, and then over here on this channel it's more Marshally. That Vox channel never sounds like a Vox. I mean, I played 100 of those amps before I had a real old vintage AC30 with blues, and when I plugged into that amp, I thought this Vox, the thing that everyone's been describing, that's a sound I've never heard in the other amps before. And so it was a real, I was going to say come to Jesus, but it's not really come to Jesus moment. It's just a real eye-opening moment, when you realize there is no substitute for that Vox sound.